The country's being torn apart in a landslide. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. I'm with Stephen Green and Bill Whittle. And gentlemen, there's a story, really kind of a series of infographics in the Wall Street Journal this week, talking about this great divide between the essentially Republicans and Democrats in this country. But it's not just an ideological or partisan divide. It's a literal physical, geographical divide. And I'll explain to you what I mean here. Back in 1980, out of 3,100 counties in the United States, there were 391 counties that were classified as landslide counties. These are counties where a presidential race would go like there would be a 20-point gap between the Republican and Democrat result in that county. So a landslide county is basically one that's either hard right or hard left. 391 of those in 1980. 20 years later, by the year 2000, there were 600 such landslide counties. And now, another 20 years later, there are 1,726 landslide counties in the United States. Now, this plays itself out in a variety of ways related to issues as diverse as religion, guns, and even the reaction to COVID-19. But Stephen Green, it essentially means that we are quite literally living in two different worlds, conservatives and liberals, Republicans, Democrats. We don't experience the same kind of country. And the influence of voters in landslide counties is growing. From in 2016, it was up to 30% of the votes in the presidential election were coming from these landslide counties, when back in 1980, it was only 4%. We can get into some of the details of the issues that this affects, but Steve, how do you even attempt to govern at a federal level a country that is so deeply divided at the local level?
Well, that is a brilliant question. Before I answer it, did it say whether the landslide counties are split evenly between Democrats or Republicans, or whether they trend Democrat or whether they trend Republican?
I don't think it had that breakdown in the story. I mean, there was a bunch of facts in that story, but I didn't see one that said there are more landslide Democrat counties, for example, than landslide Republican.
It's tougher to draw conclusions without knowing if there's a particular split one way or another, or if it's something we're all doing, regardless.
It looked like everybody's
of party.
doing it.
Everybody's doing it. Okay,
yeah.
That's good to know. The founders of this country, when they were writing up the Constitution to replace the failed Articles of Confederation, thought very long and hard about the issue of federalism. There was a historical fact, a truth, that a republic, a democratic republic, had never managed to survive for very long at anything larger than a city-state like Athens. And so they wanted to know, how do you rig things, not in a bad way, but how do you set things up so that people as diverse as New England, flinty New Englanders could get along in the same country as people down in Georgia and everything in between. And then there was another divide between the sort of coastal elites, which we still have today, and the people who lived more in the interior of the country, even though the country was only about this wide at the time. And what they came up with was a federal system, what de Tocqueville described as an incomplete national government, that the federal government would be supreme in the things that it was enabled by the Constitution to do, but that those areas were very small and limited. And we've gotten so far away from that the federal government would no longer be recognizable to any of the founding fathers who set up this system. But the reason for that is we could all basically agree, no matter what part of the country we lived in, that we needed a decent navy to protect ourselves from the British and the French, that we needed a common currency to keep trade among the several states moving and people making money and all that good stuff, that we needed a standardized system of weights and measurements so that the thing you bought here would be the same thing that you bought here, basically to encourage commerce between people and states, pardon me, but without having the power to tell people, the people in Virginia could tell New Yorkers how to live their lives, or that New Yorkers could tell people in South Carolina how to live their lives. And now we have this system where Washington can pretty much tell anybody to do anything, and we can't even tell them to go to hell anymore like we used to. So what was your question again? Oh, yes.
How can you ever hope to govern such a land?
Well, the idea was to not govern such a land very much. That was the whole premise of our national government, was there wouldn't be a whole lot of it. But now that we have this huge apparatus, it becomes very important for people, just in defense of their own liberty, of their own self-interest, to congregate together where they might enjoy a little less bossiness, maybe one fewer Karen in their lives.
Bill Whittle, let me throw a few more statistics at you and see what you can derive from these. The differences between Republicans and Democrats across the board, not just in geographic areas where they're isolating each other, but over the course of time, it seems we've grown further and further apart. For example, church attendance is down across the board, but still 32% of Republicans say they attend church on a weekly basis. 17% of Democrats. People who keep a gun. Bill, back in 1974, 54% of Democrats, and I'm sorry, I think it's the reverse, 45% of Democrats and 54% of Republicans said they kept a gun. So it was pretty close. About half the country, no matter the party, kept a gun. By 2018, 24% of Democrats, but still 52% of Republicans say they kept a gun. And then even in the reaction to COVID-19, when asked, is the COVID-19 pandemic under control, 8 in 10 Republicans said somewhat. And 8 in 10 Democrats said not at all. Bill, the gulf includes the growing extremism within the parties. In 1974, 45% of Republicans identified as conservative. By 2016, 76% identified as conservative. And Democrats, only 28% called themselves liberals back in 1974. 59% call themselves liberal now. Is this just the natural diversification of ideas, or is there something that we need to be aware of as we try to take a message of liberty to a growing, an increasingly divided public?
If you take the example of the 70s, when there were much fewer of these landslide counties, one of the reasons that the country was so much more ideologically homogenous is because we all had the same shared culture. Sunday night comes along, you got a choice of watching 60 Minutes or Hee Haw, and depending on how many kids in the house, that's going to determine which show is on. And I was never particularly fond of Hee Haw, but I was more fond of it than I was of 60 Minutes. I was a wise kid, even for my early age. Now, we all had the same experience. Everybody in the country watched I Love Lucy. Everybody in the country watched the Dick Van Dyke Show. Everybody in the country saw Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson went to extraordinary lengths to not alienate half of the country by telling the other half of the country that they're idiots because they don't agree with Johnny Carson. And so you had a very wide net. And most of the information we got from the news networks, and that was a little bit troublesome, but they were still the occasional journalist, and even, believe it or not, a patriot or two in the news business back 30, 40, 50 years ago. So so what I'm getting at is this: when cable TV came along, that fractured our common culture because the television set was the fireplace that America of the 20th century sat around. First half of the 20th century, they sat around the radio and heard the same things. And then in the second half of the 20th century, we all sat around the television and heard more or less the same things. And that was our common culture. Cable television was the beginning of the end of this. Once you had 10 channels, nobody's watching the same stuff anymore. When you have 200, nobody's watching the same stuff anymore. Now that you've got 400, everybody's watching their own individual program that's made just especially for them. And when you throw in the interactivity of the internet, now you've got the final nail in the coffin. Now you get to choose which entertainment you watch at the expense of other people's entertainment. Now you get to choose the stuff that makes you comfortable, which is the stuff that you already believe. And the more of the stuff that you see that you already believe, the more convinced you are that those things are true. And the more you are inclined to get more of that stuff, and the less willing you are to listen to something that doesn't make you comfortable. So that's what that is the technological. I almost said advances. Those are the technological appearances that have changed this country and made it much more divided. So that's what's enabled it to happen. But television and the internet don't have their own motive. They're not. They don't operate on their own. They can be made to conform to other people's political wishes. And so when you get right down to it, the definition of a conservative and a progressive, which is a much better definition than a Republican or a Democrat as far as I'm concerned, is pretty simple. Conservatives like things the way they are, and progressives want to change everything. So the country used to be a much more balanced place. The country used to be a much more homogenous place. The country used to be a much friendlier place. The country used to be a much more tolerant place. But we wanted some change. Some of us did anyway. And look, lo and behold, we have fundamentally changed the United States of America, and it's continuing to fundamentally change in this way. Essence of it is, in my opinion, is that conservatives would just like to be left alone. And if progressives felt the same way, we could all get along, but that's not how progressives function. Progressives need to tell people what to do. If there's somebody behaving without government authority, then that is as annoying to progressives as being told to do something by the government is annoying to conservatives. And so this divide is going to continue. And there's going to be two Americas. There's going to be the big red middle America, which is the part of the country that still loves the country, that waves the flag, drives pickup trucks, goes to football games, is willing to risk exposing themselves to a virus that has a 99.96% chance of survival if you are in your 30s or 40s or 50s and you happen to be one of the 20% of the population who contracts it. And this is the part of the population that still likes to drive places in their own cars and shoot guns and do things like that are independent. And then there's the other part of the country that lives in a state of perpetual fear, that is utterly convinced that this killer epidemic is on the loose. And if one person has a mask that's slipping and you're 23 years old, then that's the end of you. So you better get back in the house right away until the authorities tell you it's safe to come out again. And this is the divide. And those of us that like living our own lives don't like being told what to do. And so we move away from places like California where they tell you what to do about everything. And even that would be okay, except for the fact that one of these philosophies ends up with defunded police in cities that are on fire. And the other philosophy ends up with neighborhoods where you can leave your house unlocked at night and have your teenage daughter walk with her friend around the neighborhood block and not have the slightest concern. If that were the end result of this, we'd be happy. But unfortunately, people in blue areas see how nice it is to live in red areas, so they move from blue areas to red areas. I'm not inventing this. Look at the rental charge rate from a U-Haul from LA to Houston or from Houston to LA. You'll find out which way people are moving. They're fleeing the blue model for the red model, and the first thing they do when they get to the red model is vote to turn it blue. It's a virus, and it has to be stopped. And it's a pandemic virus. The reason people are coming apart, Scott, is because half of the country doesn't like being told what to do by the strips of elitists on the coasts. And that's not good enough for them. So people continue to retreat as far as they possibly can. And as long as these people continue to intrude into our lives and put politics into our lives as much as possible, and put politics into our lives to the degree where we don't even know what decisions we're making anymore because the choices that we're given on the internet have already been decided for us, it's just going to continue. And I don't see any way around it. All I see is a way to protect the remnant, the half of the country that still gets it, and to protect them from this constant, never-ending assault. It's an intellectual assault, and it is a physical assault, and it is a physical location assault. And people have just retreated. There's no place else to retreat to. So now we may have to think about defending the borders of this idea.
When Bill was talking, it made me think about the early days of cable television and a guy named Ted Turner got the idea that he could take his local TV station and beam it around the country. And then the ball games that were played on that local station happened to be the Atlanta Braves baseball franchise. And all of a sudden, the Atlanta Braves were America's team. And there was something kind of quaint and charming about that idea that you could take your local, city-based baseball team and sort of, Dallas Cowboys have been going by that name too, but not for the same reason. But the idea that somehow it was almost a unifying feature. It's like, oh, everybody loves the Atlanta Braves. It's America's team. That was kind of a childlike wonder era of the cable industry. And then Steve's comments, I think, were really apropos about the idea that we've already got the recipe for dealing with this kind of balkanization and division. And in fact, it was a tendency in humanity that was recognized by the founders and framers of this country. And the government structure was built explicitly to deal with the divergence of ideas and the differences of locale and the focuses of local economies that would vary widely in what they thought was a vast territory and really had no idea how vast it would eventually become. And so really, I think that the Wall Street Journal article on this growing divide is really the best argument I've ever heard for a republic and the need for a federated national government like that, because nobody should be able to force themselves on anyone else. I mean, the framers of the Constitution who lived in New Jersey were scared to death that Virginia was the big shot state and they were going to force their will upon the people of New Jersey or of Rhode Island and Providence plantations, So the small states were afraid of the big states. None of us should be afraid of anybody else. We should all be able to govern ourselves at the local level. And I think that this divide is a perfect illustration of that. It doesn't have to be a negative. It can be a thing where, people who are kind of like other people hang with the people that are kind of like them. And that's just, you see it in the lunchroom at any high school or university in the country. It just naturally happens. My favorite, actually, little infographic was at the end of this Wall Street Journal piece. When asked the question, how important is bringing the country together? Republicans, 69% said very important. Democrats, 88% said very important. Supermajorities in both parties said it's really important that we somehow figure out how to make this thing work, because it's not a war. And our neighbors are not our enemies. And ideas are not weapons. They're ways to express a vision of the world that is better than the one we have now. And Bill made a great illustration. And I said, you know what? Here's the problem with me, probably. If conservatives are those who like the way things are and progressives are those who like to change things all the time, let me just put myself down as a guy who likes the way things are and who always wants to change things. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.